Greetings everybody around the world. It's time once again for Ancient Aliens Radio. This is the dedicated radio show for the cast of Ancient Aliens. Here we interview authors and researchers as an ongoing investigation into the ancient alien theory. Don't forget to like us on Facebook or subscribe to the YouTube channel Ancient Aliens Radio. I'm delighted to have a returning guest today, Mr. Andrew Collins. This is the first show of the new year. Let me just tell you a little bit about Andrew if you haven't checked out his previous shows. He was raised in Essex town of Wickford. As a teenager, he became a UFO investigator. In 1977, he investigated the first ever missing time abduction case reported in the UK. And that investigation changed his life. He then became a journalist with the magazine Strange Phenomena, and that openly sought the help of psychics in an attempt to understand the relationship between UFOs, prehistoric sites, Earth energies, and the human mind. As a science and history writer, he's authored a variety of books that challenge the way we perceive the past, including his best-selling The Cygnus Mystery. This delves into how ancient monuments and temples are still standing today. They also all are orientated towards a Cygnus, and we're going to get into that in detail today. We haven't featured on that in the past. The last time we spoke was about Göbekli Tepe. We're going to touch on a few of Andrew's different research as well. Hopefully get into the lost caves of Giza as well. Wonderful documentary. If you haven't checked it out, you'll get that on YouTube as well. So without further ado, let's bring on our guest. Hi Andrew, welcome back.
Hello James, good to be back.
Oh, it's great to have you
Happy
back.
New Year.
Happy New Year to you too, Andrew. And wow, I know you've got an exciting year planned ahead as well, Andrew. I mean, you know, you've had quite a lucrative research career, Andrew, and discoveries too. You know, you strike me as the type of guy that wants to get the hands dirty, get your hands into the soil and do some research. And, you know, there's not many people out there like that, Andrew. I guess, tell us a little bit about that part of your persona. I think it lends credence to who you are and what you do.
Well, I think that it probably comes from my background of the type of work that I did before I really became a professional history writer, and that was the fact that I was up for sort of adventures into the landscape, working with psychics, you know, them coming up with visions and dreams. We'd follow them up and occasionally find artifacts or solve mysteries and things like that. And I wrote all of these up in books in the 1980s and 1990s, and they were a huge success. They read like fiction books, but they were actually not just based, but were actually true accounts of you know, very real events. But very gradually, I sort of changed the style to writing much more serious books on ancient history to do with Egypt, Atlantis, you know, the origins of civilization and whatever. But that flavour you can still find in my books. And the only way that works is for me to get my hands dirty, as you put it, and go to these sites. So that's meant, you know, for each of the books that I've done, I've felt it necessary and important to actually go out to these places, you know, whether it be Egypt or Turkey or Cuba, you know, looking for Atlantis, you know, Central America, North America. I was there recently climbing mountains in West Virginia, looking for evidence of the American giants and, wow, you know, whose skeletons have been found in mounds, you know, and I want to go next, to Indonesia, Java in particular, to investigate the pyramid hill of Gunung Padang. Which could be as much as 20,000 years old, possibly even earlier. But also just to try and find out what I can about, you know, the origins of the people, their myths, their legends, how the whole thing fits together for a future book on human hybrids, which we may or may not talk about today. But, I mean, so that's it really. So in other words, I feel I cannot just sit down and write a book. I have to get out there and do it. That's the base of the matter, I think.
It's wonderful. And I think you touched on it there. We're looking at a fragmented story, Andrew, and, you know, we expect to not find anything, but sometimes you do find a new line of inquiry or a new area of research, and it's only by going to places. And that may open up new windows and new research in the next generation and the next generation. And it only, you know, there are armchair researchers out there, Andrew, and that's why I say that, you know, and that's fine. I mean, we need the academics too, Andrew, but you strike me as one that goes between both worlds, the academic and in the field, and it's a wonderful mix.
It's a very careful mix.
It's a careful, yeah.
You know, I mean, it's like with the Göbekli Tepe book that came out last year. I mean, the first half of it is a very, you know, good, serious attempt to understand Göbekli Tepe, who constructed it, why, and when. And then the second half of the book, you know, eases up and it studies the origins of the Watchers, the Nephilim, the Anunnaki. But it's a hands-on book that ends up with me out, you know, in eastern Turkey, looking for the origin point of everything, you know, the Garden of Eden, you know, the place of the foundation of the Anunnaki and the rest of it. And in other words, it's like, you know, it's like the first half is like, this is the serious background. The second half, right, let's let our hair down and go out and see what we find.
Sure. I love that show we did, Andrew, on Göbekli Tepe, because it was the first solid, you know, condensed piece of research into Göbekli Tepe, where everybody just wanted to put its name in a book and write a little bit about it and attach themselves to the name, where you sat there and you waited until you had the research done, Andrew, and you waited. And that took, I mean, it's a 500-page book, Andrew, and, you know, it's quite a wealth and volume of material. So well done on that. We're going to revisit the Nephilim today, I think, Andrew. Yeah. I want to just go, and I want to start at the Cygnus mystery first, because for me, Andrew, you know, I read a lot of archaeoastronomy books. I'm mad about archaeoastronomy. I love it. And for me, this is the timeless one. This is the one that really kind of puts so much together. Great that you find books on Serpent Mound, or you find books on Newgrange, or you find books on Stonehenge, or you find books on Callanish, and, you know, great that all is. But what Cygnus mystery does is it ties a lot of stuff together, and it's a timeless piece, and one of my favorite archaeoastronomy books. So maybe just tell us about the Cygnus mystery and revisit that today, Andrew.
Okay, well, once again, it starts with Göbekli Tepe because, I mean, I've been studying this proto-Neolithic culture, who seem to be responsible for Göbekli Tepe. I've been studying them since the mid-1990s. Mm-hmm. However, the discovery of Göbekli Tepe, was only announced in the year 2000. And I mean, it was immediately brought to my attention by a colleague, and I just realised this was the mother lode. This was it. This is what I'd been looking for. This was the absolute piece of evidence for a lost civilization, the smoking gun, which I've been looking for. However, it took me 4 years to get there. I was invited out for a conference in Diyarbakir, which is the administrative centre of Kurdish eastern Turkey. Mm-hmm. And I went there and I basically just said to them, look, if I'm coming, you know, for me, could you provide me with the ability to get to some of these sites I'm going to be talking about? So they gave me a driver and an interpreter for a week, and I just went around all of these sites. And so I went straight out to Göbekli Tepe, and we got there, and there was nobody there at all. The only people that we saw was a local farmer and his son, who'd actually been sort of trying to report to the local authorities that there was something there for years. Nobody had taken any notice of them. And the place was still half excavated at this point. I say no archaeologists there, no tourists, nothing. And I remember looking at these stones and just thinking that I just needed to get into the mindset of those that had constructed this. I mean, it was so strange. The imagery, the feel of it was so different to anything that existed in the Middle East or in Egypt or even in the Indus Valley, that it almost gave a sense of Central or Southern American in the appearance of the carved art. So I came back from there, and I remember it just played on my mind for days afterwards. And you know, and myself, my wife, then we'd go to out socially, and just what was all that I could see in my head was just Göbekli Tepe. And I just had an insight at that point, because I sussed that the stones and the huge central monoliths seemed to be faced towards the north, just off the north, towards the northwest. Sure. And everything about them seemed to be almost like if you walked into a church, let's say from the west or from the south, you then walk into the central aisle and you go up towards the eastern altar. Always the altar is in the east for a Christian church, because that's the direction of heaven in Christian tradition. And I wondered whether the builders of Göbekli Tepe, maybe 11,000 years ago, saw something of importance in the northern night sky. I also was aware that the peoples who came to thrive on the plain just below Göbekli Tepe, at the ancient city of Haran, believed in the north as the place of the primal cause, the place of God, the place where souls came from and returned in death, the place of power where you drew the energy for life. And I realized that various other traditions and populations in that region also originally had seen the North and the North Pole in particular as the focal point of the heavens. And so I started to look at the heavens for about 9000 BC, and I realized that the only bright star that seemed to be aligned to the keystones at Göbekli was the star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus. Now that's the celestial swan or bird, also known as the Northern Cross, which is a very, very prominent cross shape of stars in the northern night sky, which is placed exactly over the point on the Milky Way where it splits into two separate streams for a short distance before it eventually goes back and becomes just one stream in the area of Sagittarius and Scorpio, where the sun actually crosses the Milky Way in one of two places in the sky. And where Cygnus is placed, I began to find around the world that this point was seen as the entry and exit into the sky world. In other words, it's almost like the cosmic gate or a stargate that allowed the soul, whether it be the soul of somebody who was now deceased or that of the shaman, to travel from this world through into the other world via this gate in Cygnus. And this was present in ancient Egyptian beliefs, in the beliefs of the Maya of Central America. It was there in Peru amongst the Inca. It was there amongst many Native American tribes. In fact, that's work I've continued to do to try and understand the significance of this so-called path of souls that lead into the other world, the name that Native American people give to the Milky Way. And I found it everywhere in Indian, from the Asian subcontinent, etc. And even in China, that there was evidence of it as well.
China.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. I mean, in China, a lot of the ancient beliefs in religion were focused upon the north, and a number of their greatest temples seem to be focused in that orientation towards the pole star. And the pole star is another clue here as to Cygnus's importance.
Sure.
Because although today the pole star is Polaris, a star in the constellation of Ursa Minor, the little bear, the processes involved with what's known as precession, the slow wobble of the Earth across a cycle of 26,000 years, means that the pole star shifts. In other words, the different stars take that role of what's known as the pole star, the celestial pole, the point of the celestial pole. And just before Göbekli Tepe was constructed, between the period 16,500 BC and around 13,000 BC, the stars of Cygnus, most obviously Deneb, had acted as pole star in the night sky. And that after this time, the pole star became Vega in the constellation of Lyra, which is obviously neighbouring that as the celestial pole was slowly shifting. But by the time you get to Göbekli Tepe, around 11,000 years ago, there was actually no star marking that position whatsoever.
Sure.
And I think what happened was that the people of Göbekli Tepe harked back to older Paleolithic ideas, which had been around obviously for several thousand years at this point, about the significance of Cygnus marking this gateway into the other world, both from the perspective of its point on the Milky Way, where it broke into two to create what's known as the Great Rift or Dark Rift, this stream down the middle of the white lines of the Milky Way.
Sure.
But also the fact that Cygnus had previously been a pulsar. In other words, it had this double whammy importance in the minds of these people to do with the Milky Way and the pulsar, which made sure that it kept within the beliefs and understanding of the people of Göbekli Tepe. But those at Göbekli Tepe, the people that constructed it almost certainly came from somewhere else in the ancient world. Sure. And my indications show in Göbekli Tepe that they came from the north, from the area of central Russia, and were part of a tradition known as the Swiderian. This is what they're called in archaeology. Mm-hmm. The Swiderian peoples were very, very advanced. I mean, they were advanced shamans. They had knowledge of astronomy. Their myth cycles involved the swan, the wolf, and the deer in particular. And they themselves were part of a much older tradition which had risen up across Europe and right the way into central and even eastern Siberia as far back as 40,000 years ago. Wow. Where the swan almost certainly was one of the key symbols of their beliefs, because the swan was seen as one of the primary symbols of the soul traveling from this world into the next. In other words, it was a symbol of the soul. It was a symbol of what the Greeks referred to as the psychopomp, the soul carrier, or the soul accompanier. And these people were the first to actually recognize birds as the vehicles of the soul. And the most obvious bird used for this was the swan. And of course, the swan eventually becomes the symbol of not just the constellation of Cygnus, but of the Milky Way as a whole. Mm-hmm. In various cultures, not just in Europe and in Siberia, but also in the Americas, amongst various Native American tribes, showing how old it is, because presumably these ideas came across from Siberia before the land bridge between Siberia and North America closed around 8,500 BC, is that they believe that the Milky Way was known as the bird's way, sometimes the goose way. Mm. The goose is a bird which is synonymous with the swan in many ancient cultures. Sure, and in fact, even in India, the name for swan is exactly the same as goose, which is Hamsa. And the Hamsa was the symbol of the constellation of Cygnus as far back as Vedic times. And also the Hamsa or swan goose was also seen as the bird of creation. And this is the other important thing, because across the world, on the Eurasian continent and also in the Americas, mm-hmm. The swan in particular was seen as a bird of creation. And when it wasn't a swan, it was a goose. When it wasn't a goose, it was often something like an eagle or a thunderbird, occasionally a bird of paradise in the Pacific, the hawk occasionally, things like this. In other words, whichever birds were of greatly significant to a particular culture or population became associated with the same ideas. But when you come to somewhere like Göbekli Tepe, which is in eastern Anatolia, mm-hmm. the swan wasn't really a bird of importance. I don't know why. Maybe there just wasn't any swans around in that area around 11,000 years ago. So what happened was another bird took its place, and that was the vulture. Mm-hmm. The vulture became the primary symbol of the passage of the soul from this world into the next world. And the reason why it became so important is because of the process of excarnation. Yeah. And this is where the body is placed out for the so-called sky burial. The sky burial is where, the birds
pick clean, they pick the body
come down, pick clean the body, the flesh from a body. They tear at it. And then the bones that remain are left to calcine in the sun's heat, and eventually they will be collected up and given what's known as a secondary or disarticulated burial. In other words, they'll be put into a little box, a stone box or whatever, and put away. Or maybe they were distributed in some other manner. We don't know. But this is a process that almost certainly was going on from Paleolithic times through into the beginning of the Neolithic, and seemed to heavily influence the beliefs, traditions, and the cosmology of the proto-Neolithic peoples like those at Göbekli Tepe. And of course, we find images of the vulture very prominently displayed at Göbekli Tepe and at other early Neolithic sites that are part of that same tradition.
I think the swan is probably the most accurate bird you could use to represent the configuration of stars. Personally, I see a swan like 100% accuracy. That doesn't say you can't use many birds. I think the Egyptians maybe use a different bird. It doesn't really matter. Long neck, wings, tail. There's many birds that could be representative of it. I just think the swan is probably the best. I call it the swan constellation just because I'm lazy and I don't call it the Cygnus, but it's astronomical term.
Swan is correct. I mean, obviously Cygnus is simply its Latin name.
Yeah.
Cygnus means swan. That is absolutely correct. But even for Christians, it was very important, probably from the early centuries of the Christian era, as the symbol of the cross of Christ, which is a symbol of death and rebirth, of course. Even within Christian tradition, the connections were there, and that the connections between the Christian ideas and earlier pagan traditions comes via the figure known as Orpheus. Orpheus of the underworld, he had his lyre, his musical instrument, and eventually he was beheaded by these mad, women, who are involved in this bacchanalic festival. And what happens is after his death is that he becomes a swan and is transferred up into the heavens and becomes the constellation of Cygnus, and his instrument, his lyre, becomes the constellation next to him, which is obviously Lyra, of which the primary star is Vega. So Orpheus is there, but there's actually one very famous, a very curious magical gem from the very early beginning of the Christian period, let's say 2nd, 3rd, 4th century AD, that shows this crucified figure on a cross, and you would assume that it was Christ, a very early depiction of Jesus on the cross, if it were not for the fact that the word Orpheus is actually written right across it, and it's obviously an image of Orpheus himself. In other words, what the early Christians did in places like the catacombs of Rome is adopt a lot of the traditions that were previously associated with Orpheus, and transferred them to Jesus, because they seemed to fit perfectly, and it allowed people to evolve their pre-existing pagan beliefs into those of early Christianity. So, Cygnus plays a role even within Christianity itself, and I find this, this intriguing, and I'm amazed in many ways that a lot of Christians have not actually come forward and said, thank you for explaining, the reason why Cygnus is associated with the cross of Christ.
Well, also, Andrew, and this is going to tie in with the next, we're going to talk some megaliths in a second, but, megalithic monuments, call them pagan monuments, if you will, or the pagan people, pagan traditions have at least carried on the megalithic builders, and then the pagans became Christianized. So I wonder, was there crossover there as well?
Obviously, Göbekli Tepe is arguably the earliest megalithic monuments that are accepted by archaeology.
By a mile, yeah.
But we're still dealing with standing stones. And as the millennia rolled by, the standing stones started to become more cruder, more rude in their appearance, until eventually you get the megalithic monuments that are found all over Europe, and of course, obviously, in many other parts of the world. And these are generally placed in circles, in avenues, in rows, or in other types of settings. And many of these are also aligned to Cygnus. I mean, that some very obvious examples are, for instance, at Avebury, which is probably the largest stone circle in the world, its central axis is perfectly aligned to the setting of Deneb in Cygnus to around a date of 3000 BC.
Wow.
And I mean, this is exactly the same alignment as is found at Göbekli Tepe. Plus places like Callanish in Scotland.
Yeah. Great example.
I mean, not only is it an actual cross design, I mean, it's like a Celtic cross in its appearance. So it actually reflects the shape of Cygnus anyway before you even start. That also seems to be aligned quite perfectly to the star at the centre of the cross at Cygnus, which is Sadir. And for a date of around 3000 BC. Then if we transfer over to Ireland, Newgrange, the interior passage there is cross-shaped, and it's been likened to the shape of the stars of Cygnus. Even a kink in the long arm of Cygnus is reflected in the inner chamber at Newgrange. Now, Newgrange was constructed around 3000 BC. We all know it's famous for the fact that at sunrise on the midwinter solstice, the sun shines through this light box, as it's called, comes into an inner chamber right in the centre of the monument and illuminates certain key carved symbols. Beautiful phenomena, happens every day, still happens today. However, what people perhaps don't know is that if at the point when the sun strikes, you follow that line back over the hill where the sun is seen to rise, you come to another monument, a smaller passage grave known as Four Knocks. And if you go inside here, it's like a miniature Newgrange monument. Yeah. And just before sunrise on the very same day of the winter solstice, if you're in there, you see, and this is clearly specifically done, and I mean, this is not my findings, this was the findings of an Irish researcher by the name of Anthony Murphy, who's written a whole book on the mysteries of Newgrange, is that you see that the bright star Deneb of Cygnus rising up exactly within the frame of the opening of Four Knocks. So in other words, I think the idea was for the people to start their activities at Four Knocks before dawn, witness the rising of Cygnus, and then to walk from there over the hill to Newgrange, and where the sun would then be received at the point of sunrise, or just shortly after sunrise. In other words, it was part of a ceremonial landscape that involved not just the rebirth of the sun, but also the proximity of Cygnus itself. And the connection between Cygnus and the sun is also very obvious, because you have this tube, this dark rift coming down from Cygnus down the centre of the Milky Way, and then it opens out finally and dissolves in the area of Sagittarius stroke Scorpio. Well, this is exactly where the sun crosses the Milky Way. In other words, this is the place where if the sun is about to rise and the Milky Way is crossing it, you'll see the Milky Way stretching up into the sky just before sunrise, and this will be blotted out eventually by the light of the sun, but it will give the impression that the sun is being born from the Great Rift or the Dark Rift, which begins, of course, in Cygnus. In other words, it looks like the sun is being born from Cygnus. That's why it was so important at places like Avebury and Newgrange and things like this, because it was seen as the point of the rebirth of life on Earth. And I think this is really significant. It was something that was there in the beliefs of many people in 2012. You know, they believed that the sun was going to be reborn in Sagittarius, which from our position corresponds to the center of our own Milky Way galaxy. In other words, if we look at the sun as it rises on the horizon at midwinter, if you look through that and carry on, you'd eventually come to the center of our galaxy. Mm-hmm. And this all was a part of that. But what all of these people seem to miss was the fact that this new sun was going to be reborn from Cygnus itself. So, in other words, it's something which is still relevant even today.
Fornox, with this 17 degrees east of north alignment, of course, it doesn't take in this, the moon, or it doesn't take in anything else, really. It's only taken in this very special, there's no other, there's no other contender. Yeah. There's actually there's a whole host of monuments dotted across Ireland, different places, different, complexes. And they're all at 17 degrees east of north, and the archaeologists just have no clue. They actually just ignore them because they don't understand them. They don't understand this strange alignment, and this is the only thing that fits, Andrew. This Cygnus mission.
Exactly. And I mean, and the problem comes from the fact that people don't understand why Cygnus is so important, and this is exemplified by the fact that in the 1960s, the American astronomer Gerald Hawkins obviously came to Britain, examined Stonehenge, and did a lot of great work there with early computers, and decided that it was like some kind of megalithic computer, calculating the not just the moon rises, but also the solar and lunar eclipses. Great stuff, obviously. Great book, Stonehenge Decoded, bestseller around the world. Mm-hmm. However, what was he going to do for a follow-up, a sequel? Sure. So he started to look at Avebury, and he started to see if he could determine similar patterns here. And he found out that the granddaddy of archaeoastronomy, Alexander Todd, had concluded that the central axis of Avebury was aligned to the setting of Deneb in Cygnus. And Gerald Hawkins wrote in a book, I can't remember, it's something other than Mind Steps, I can't remember the exact title at the moment, it's in the Cygnus Mystery book, that this was impossible. Why would such an important monument be aligned to such an insignificant star? That's essentially the words he used. Really? And that he assumed, therefore, it must be aligned to the south towards something there, or maybe even a supernova or something that's now missing. But he's missing the point of the significance of Cygnus, because what he's forgetting is that before solar beliefs became very prominent at the time of the Neolithic Revolution and thereafter, because the sun was now so important to the ripening of crops, that the moon was almost certainly the most important regulator of time in the sky, and the thing that regulated the human body clock, particularly for females, but that also the stars had a much more prominent role in the cosmology of the ancient peoples. This Gerald Hawkins seemed to forget, but was resurrected by another megalithic writer, an archaeoastronomer by the name of John North. And he did a book, I think Stonehenge was in the title, I can't remember the full title at the moment, and he brought back this fact that you had stellar worship, you had moon worship, and then only after these came solar worship. And that what he showed is that the earliest megalithic monuments in Britain seem to be aligned either to stars or to the moon. And I believe these are beliefs that go back probably for tens of thousands of years. I mean, that it's stuff which comes probably even from our distant cousins, the Neanderthals. The books of Stan Gush that talked about the significance, the importance of hybridization between the Neolithic people and our own ancestors, Homo sapiens, created a new mindset. But that what the Neanderthals introduced was the significance of spirituality, the significance of dreaming, and of spiritual values, which involved the significance of the moon and the stars and things like this. And I think he was probably right. I mean, our own ancestors, Homo sapiens, were much more rationalized, survivalist-based people, that were territorial grabbing. I don't think that our own ancestors were as intelligent as we actually give them credit for. I think that a lot of our more intuitive side does come from hybridization, from Neanderthals.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with you, Andrew, on that. And I know there's evidence of prime numbers being etched on bones going back so far into antiquity, and moon calculations being etched in bones and stuff like that, lunar phases.
That's exactly correct.
It's going so far that we just don't know how to deal with it. We don't know how to grasp that intelligence being there, because we think intelligence is, the electronic industry or something, we seem so fixated on that. Andrew, I want to just mention the Olmecs and Loventa, because again, this has got an 8 degrees east of north alignment in Cygnus as well. Maybe just mention that and just kind of give credence to American monuments too for a moment.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, what we find at Loventa is that the axis orientation seems to be very much focused on Deneb, the bright star of Cygnus, but also Sadir, which is the star at the centre of the cross of Cygnus, and that work that was carried out there showed that one particular symbol that cropped up in Maya, but also seemed to be present in earlier Olmec tradition, which is known as the crossband symbol. Which is found on various Olmec monuments, such as these were-jaguars altars, where it seems as though there's a figure emerging out of what appears to be almost like a sort of entrance to a cave, or some kind of gateway or whatever, has either on his forehead or above him in some way the symbol of the crossband symbol. And this crossband symbol has been identified as the sign of the constellation of Cygnus. And what's being shown here is that the were-jaguar, which seems to be a figure associated with the rebirth of the sun, is emerging from the dark rift, having come from Cygnus itself to be reborn on the horizon at Sagittarius, the point of connection between the Milky Way and our own, heliocentric world. Sure. And so that's found there. Of course, obviously, it's there in Mayan tradition as well, and it's something I've looked into in great detail in Cygnus Mystery, and I relook at it again in the Göbekli Tepe book.
Andrew, for me, I look at this whole enigma and I say, okay, this is great. This is a wealth of information. It's clearly these guys are looking at Cygnus, using Cygnus. I think it's derogatory to call it mythology. I think it was their philosophy, if you want to call it that. I don't want to even say religion.
It's cosmology. Cosmology is the best word.
But these guys were so fixated on this cosmology, and I want to bring in the cygnets now. This is X-ray pulsar stars that are located there, because I think this might be a clue to why these guys are so dogmatic about this constellation.
Well, see, this is the bonus of the Cygnus mystery. I mean, all that we've talked about covers about the first 3/4 of the book, and the last quarter of the book, I threw caution to the wind and tried to see whether there was a greater significance for Cygnus.
I really like this, though, Andrew. This is crucial, I think.
And I'm glad I put it in there. In some ways, I could have just left it there and it would have been a very sensible book. But there seemed to be something about this that I felt intuitively right, and I felt I needed to mention this. And that's the fact that we're obviously dealing with shamans, we're dealing with people who are in altered states of consciousness for long periods of time. We're dealing with Paleolithic peoples initially who would have spent long periods of time in cave environments. We know obviously they were depicting cosmological scenes amongst the shamanic art, within these Ice Age caves in France and Spain, for instance. And we know that Cygnus appears amongst them. I mean, I cite two good examples, one being Lascaux in the Dordogne region of southern France. I think it's Dordogne, is it?
Yeah.
And Chauvet which dates back probably as early as about 30,000 years ago.
Fascinating places.
And it's in the Arctic region. And both of them have got imagery which unquestionably, in my opinion, seems to show Cygnus and in particular the Milky Way. This is the crucial thing. It's not just Cygnus. This is what people seem to forget. Cygnus is prominently placed on the Milky Way. The Milky Way is arguably one of the most important things in the night sky. Mm-hmm. You know, it was seen universally as a road, a river, mm-hmm. you know, or some kind of causeway that would take you into the next world. It's just a matter of where on the Milky Way you decide that point of entrance into the other world is. The path is undisputably the Milky Way. And I'm sure that this is there and it's depicted in abstract form in Paleolithic art, just as it is in much later traditions. But let's think about these people in these caves for long periods of time. You know, they're there probably in the dark for most of the period. They're obviously doing their thing in altered states of consciousness, almost certainly psychotropic drugs, hallucinogens would have been involved in some manner. And they're having strange experiences. I mean, let's assume that. Let's assume that they're having weird ones basically down there. And these weird ones are, you know, giving them some kind of philosophy for life, that they're instructing them, they're telling them what to do, when to come back, who to communicate with, and what's going on, presumably, in the cosmos as a whole. So with that in mind, bear in mind the fact that in the 1980s, a series of underground experiments were conducted in which particle physicists attempted to split the proton, which is a subatomic particle. And they could only do this in facilities that were many hundreds of meters underground or within rock, because cosmic radiation affects these type of experiments. In other words, you know, you'll get so many hits from, you know, incoming particles and things like this that you can't see the wood for the trees. Mm-hmm. So they have to be done either in deep mines that are obviously now abandoned, or in the middle of not caves, in the middle of mountains like Mont Blanc in France. This was used for some of the experiments.
Sure.
And so the experiments started, and what was found universally around the world is that every 4.8 hours they would get this cycle of incoming subatomic particles that would be affecting the results. And at first they couldn't make out what they were. They assumed that there was a possibility that they could be cosmic rays, because very, very few types of particle can penetrate deep rock. But the fact that they were coming in 4.8 hour cycles was a signature, and only one cosmic object in the sky had exactly the same signature, and that was something called Cygnus X3. Clearly, obviously, in the constellation of Cygnus, very close to the center of the cross, very close to the star Sadia. And this is either a black hole, or I like to think it's probably more a neutron star, which is a collapsed, sort of main sequence star that spent all of its energy, helium and hydrogen energy and collapsed in on itself to form this mass of energy and matter, which is probably only about 15-20 kilometers in diameter, but sends out the most incredibly high energy particles, most particularly via these jets of plasma that go literally light years into the stellar medium, destroying anything in their path and sending out other types of particles like X-rays, gamma rays, radio waves, things on infrared and stuff like this, which are picked up by satellite arrays, either in space or arrays of telescopes, focused on particular frequencies down on the Earth itself. And Cygnus X3 was discovered, I think, in the late 1960s, but in the early 1970s, it became very famous because the highest readings of radio waves were picked up from any stellar body coming from there. So it went on the map during the early 1970s. But now, during the 1980s, particles, cosmic rays, were being received deep underground in a manner which was absolutely unique at this time. I mean, this was the only confirmed source for any types of particles like this. And it seemed as if they were not normal cosmic rays. Normal cosmic rays come in from anywhere, like our own sun produce cosmic rays. Sure. Many other, stars and things like that produce them. But generally, cosmic rays are positively charged. And what this means is that they're affected by magnetic fields. And therefore, by the time that they actually reach our own upper atmosphere, they're so scrambled that you're not sure where the hell they come from. Basically, they could come from our sun, they could come from other stellar sources. But these ones coming from Cygnus X3 were neutrally charged. And what this actually means is that they were able to come straight from their point of origin to us directly, and not only penetrate the upper atmosphere, but penetrate the ground and penetrate through solid rock for 200 to 300 meters at least to be registered in these arrays. Okay, so we've got that. Now, Cygnus X3 is a very, very strange object. I mean, some people will even suggest that it's an example of what's known as a quark star, which means that it's made of the subatomic particles known as quarks, and is so powerful, so strong, that it actually bends space-time and bends gravity. I mean, I've written about this. You can read all about this if you just type in, quark star, Cygnus X3, what I've written about it will come up there, and some of the primary source material, of course, as well. So there's something very strange about Cygnus X3. The other important thing is that these huge beams or jets of particles, one of them is directed at our solar system within a 10-degree radius of differentiation of it. In other words, one of these jets points towards us like a cosmic gun barrel, basically. That's the reason why we get so much particles and energy coming from Cygnus X3. Okay, well, this is all nice stuff. This is science, it's astronomy, astrophysics. But how might it affect our shaman deep down in the caves? Well, here's the facts. If they're in these caves for long periods of time, what we know is that the eye and the brain can actually see cosmic rays. And what I mean by this is that in the 1960s and early 1970s, when the Apollo missions, went to the moon and up into space and orbited around the moon, what they found is that the astronauts found it very difficult to sleep, because whether they had their eyes open or closed, they saw these flashes of white light before their eyes. And subsequent experiments showed that these were cosmic rays passing through the viscous part of the eye, or even through the nerve cortex area that was being interpreted by the brain as incoming light. So you see these flashes. Now, this is something that is very common out in space, because there are many, many cosmic rays which are generally caught within the upper atmosphere and do not reach the Earth. However, deep underground, 200 to 300 meters, in theory, all of this is blocked out completely, because the rock will stop cosmic rays, but not those from Cygnus X3. In other words, your shaman is down there in the caves and suddenly starts seeing all these flashes in front of his eyes. He's going to wonder what the hell's going on, or she, obviously. And it's not going to take them very long to realise that this takes place when the constellation of Cygnus rises at its fullest above them. And it would only probably take maybe a few generations for them to realise that there was a connection between the presence of Cygnus in the sky and these incredible experiences of seeing the light deep down in these caves, which is where they're obviously creating all this cave art and imagery and whatever. So there would have been a connection, a cosmological connection.
It's a beautiful.
But I think there's more. I think that there's a possibility, and I argue this in the final chapters of the book, that the most likely cosmic source to have affected human evolution is Cygnus X3. All the evidence seems to point towards that.
Yeah, it could jumper DNA. It definitely, I think, it could mutate, or it depends if we could be down the barrel of the gun for a long period of time, or it could flash over Earth and differentiate and move around. I love the theory. It's the whole concept is wonderful, Andrew. Andrew, I've held off Giza and the Cygnus link there because I want to tie it in with the lost caves of Giza, and we're going to get into that. We're going to take a break in just a moment. But before we do, Andrew, tell us, you've got a couple of tours coming up this year, and I want you to give out your website as well, just before we go on to break. I believe you got Angkor Wat, Göbekli Tepe, Peru, Bolivia. Give us out some of the details on the dates, Andrew.
Okay, well, if you want to come to Southeast Asia, in particular the area around Angkor Wat and the great beautiful Buddhist and Hindu temples, then we're going there around the spring equinox. Göbekli Tepe and the surrounding area, Haran, and other, important sites. We're going there in May and September this year, on short breaks. And if you want to go to Peru and Bolivia in June with myself, Hugh Newman and Brian Forrester investigating the mystery of the elongated skulls, then we're going there also. And all the details relating to these tours are available on www.andrewcollins.com right now. So they're all there on the front page, so all the details. But what I would say is that if you are interested in going to Göbekli Tepe, do it this year, because it's going to be closed for an extended period of time when they put the permanent roof on it and change it into a open air museum, which it's going to become. So this is probably your last chance to see Göbekli Tepe as it was.
I just want to take a moment to mention Klaus Schmidt as well, and a little remembrance for Klaus. I know you knew him, Andrew. Sad to see him go. He did say he would finish his days out there in Göbekli Tepe. So
strangely prophetic.
Yeah, sad to see him go so soon. I just hope they're going to continue the research and get somebody on the team. But I think maybe they're going to take a transition period, as you say, put the roof on and get better conditions out there.
Well, the thing about Göbekli Tepe is that I think the main discoveries for the moment are over. What you see is what you're going to get. They're doing new work on the very northwestern part of the occupational mound, and they're dropping in these sort of excavation areas, which are about, I think, 9 meters in square, about 30 feet across. And I've seen some of the stones that are coming out of them. And I mean, there's one really beautiful one with, like sort of lion or panther leaping up, which I was able to film a couple of years ago. But a lot of the other ones that they're coming up with don't look that good, to be honest. I mean, they're fragmentary to start. It looks like the weather's really, affected them. And so far we're not getting the same huge, beautiful monuments that you see already. Now, it could well be that they just struck lucky with the area, sure, the area of the occupation mound that they did. Probably not. No, I think that there are other beautiful ones, but Klaus Schmidt himself said that most of the occupational mound would never be excavated. And I think this is a travesty of justice. We really need to know what's underneath there, sure, and how it relates to the origins of civilization. So, in other words, I think they're going to dither about for a while. And this will, as you say, be a transition period.
Is it a question of funding, Andrew? Would it be just a question of money or funding?
No, they've got a very big Turkish financier, who is a huge oil mogul, who has also funded work at, Çatalhöyük at southern central, sure, Turkey, and he's now come on board at Göbekli Tepe and has basically said, look, you need money, you know, you can have it. So that is really not the problem. The problem is a case of the Turkish authorities and the way that they perceive Göbekli Tepe as a moneymaker, because most other ancient monuments, historical places in in Turkey are what's known as open air museums. Mm-hmm. Places like the fairy chimneys of Cappadocia, mm-hmm. Even the Hagia Sophia, cathedral, now obviously a mosque in Istanbul. Mm-hmm. All of these are so-called museums, basically. Mm. And these are money makers because obviously they install tourist shops and all the rest of it, charge quite a high price for people to enter onto the site. And that's what they want Göbekli Tepe to be. They're tying it in with a brand new, huge museum, which they're opening at Şanlıurfa, the local city to Göbekli Tepe, just 8 miles away. Yeah. And this is going to be the second largest museum of its type in the whole of Turkey, wow. with the only bigger one being in Ankara. And that's opening this year. So you can see that it's all part of a bigger picture to turn this into a tourist attraction. Yeah. And I get the sense between you and I, and obviously all your listeners, that this was one of the things that was upsetting Klaus Schmidt shortly before he died. Yeah. Because the last time I met him, mm-hmm. which was not a few months, but it was when was it? Let me think. Towards the end of 2013. And he didn't seem a happy man, I'll be honest. Yeah. He was very short. He wouldn't allow me to look at the areas that he normally, would allow people like myself or Graham Hancock to have a look around. Mm-hmm. And, that he seemed to be a slightly changed man. And I sense that what was going on in his head is that he felt that Göbekli Tepe was being taken away from him. Yeah. That even though he was going to continue his excavations there, now they were marginalised in the northwest, corner of the occupational mound, and that the main site itself was just going to become a huge, great tourist attraction. And that's not what an archaeologist wants to see. No. They want to know that they have full control over a site and what they can do there.
Sure. Andrew, we're at the top of the first hour. We're going to take a quick break. Hold that thought. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about the Giza Plateau and the lost caves of Giza. Hi everybody, and welcome back. This is your host James, and we are talking to Mr. Andrew Collins. You can catch his website andrewcollins.com, and you'll find the articles and the books we're talking about there. You can also catch the links to his tours. Andrew, welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
Andrew, I saved Giza for the second half because there's a great correlation between Giza and Cygnus, so maybe we can tie Cygnus in with the Giza Plateau. Rodney Hale, I think it was, showed the accuracy of the Cygnus with photographs compared to another theory. If you want to mention that, Andrew, maybe as a
it's a sort of amusing story, really, because Rodney Hale is a chartered engineer, and he's worked with me on various projects, mm-hmm. Particularly to do with archaeoastronomy and looking at various sites around the world for 15 years at least, maybe more. Mm-hmm. And he was involved with things like the Dragon Project with Paul Devereux, for instance, in examining prehistoric sites in the late 70s, early 80s to see if there was any kind of anomalous energies. I mean, he manufactured all of the equipment that they used for it, for instance. And so, he's certainly a man who, and he's now in his 80s, but he's still as alert and, proficient in all of his work. And anyway, cut long story short, he read the Orion Mystery when it first came out in about, 1993, I think. Mm-hmm. And this was a great book. I read it at the same time. I thought it was a fantastic book. And, obviously by Robert Bouval and Adrian Gilbert. Also, mostly Robert Bouval's ideas, from what I understand. And, but the thing was that Rodney is not somebody that will just read something and accept somebody's words. He will go away and check it. And what hadn't been shown is that the three stars that supposedly represent the three pyramids of Giza, the three Orion stars, which supposedly match, and therefore, you know, the whole thing was done on purpose on the landscape to reflect the stars. He checked, and he found that if you put two of the stars over the, over the peaks of the pyramids, the third one, which obviously you can always do two because you can always match them on it, but the third one didn't even hit the third pyramid at all. And so, you know, you think if the ancient Egyptians aligned the Great Pyramid with such perfection, absolute perfection, you know, clearly they had the ability to line up what they wanted where they needed to. Why would they be so inaccurate in the placement of the pyramids if they wanted to try and replicate the position of stars? I mean, this never made any sense to Rodney Hale. And there were other complications with the Orion correlation theory, which troubled Rodney Hale as an engineer. I think that's the best way of putting it.
Sure.
But that was that, and you know, the matter was put to rest until I started looking into Cygnus as this place of the afterlife, the place of creation in many different cultures, populations, traditions around the world, going all the way back to Paleolithic times. And one night he was, in bed, apparently unable to sleep, and he was just thinking about the Orion correlation and about the three belt stars, the three wing stars of Cygnus, i.e. the wings of the bird. And for some reason thought that there was a possibility that those three stars accurately reflected the geographical positions of the pyramids on the ground at Giza, and that they may be a much better fit than the belt stars of Orion. And apparently, when he got up the morning, excitedly went away, and, you know, found a good, picture of the stars of Cygnus, you know, I mean, proper, photograph. So it's, you know, absolutely accurate. And then replicated those over the positions of the three pyramids, and they matched perfectly, absolutely perfect match. They could not be any better. Yeah. And I remember he sent me an email that day. This was in January 2005. And I just thought, oh my God. I mean, the trouble is that Robert Bouval was a very good friend of mine. I supported him and his work for many years. I'd done many conferences where he'd attended. And I just thought, if I put this in print, I'm not only going to alienate Robert Bouval, but all of those that believe the Orion correlation theory, of which there are probably many, many tens of thousands of those around the world. And they're not going to be happy with this whatsoever, because the idea of Orion being at the core of ancient cosmologies, which essentially is correct anyway, is something that's almost seen as a fervent belief as opposed to a statement of fact. You know, in other words, it spurred on a lot of people's ideas to do with aliens coming from Orion, and, you know, how Orion was the symbol of the primordial, foundations of humanity, etc., etc. So I thought, well, if I am going to mention this in the Cygnus mystery, I've got to do some very, very serious research to try and back it up and show the context of Cygnus in Egypt. And eventually I found it. And this was the fact that a American astronomer by the name of Ronald Wells had in the 70s and 80s published a number of articles showing that the Milky Way was seen in ancient Egypt, excuse me, as the sky goddess Nuit. Now, she's usually shown arched over the earth, represented by the god Geb. And she's shown naked, and she's associated with the fact of the sun dying each day and being seen to pass through what's known as the duat or underworld, symbolized by the interior of her, almost like the gullet, her body, her womb, her stomach, etc., and being reborn, obviously from between her loins, and but at the point of its reappearance on the horizon the next morning, and that this wasn't just something that was believed to take place on a daily basis, but on a yearly basis in connection with the midwinter solstice, just like in connection with with Newgrange and the other megalithic monuments of Britain.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And in other words, the ancient Egyptians saw the sun as being reborn from the dark rift area of the Milky Way. That formed the legs and the area between the legs of this goddess as pictured in the sky. Now, in my book, and in Ronald Wells' own work, there are reconstructions to show the overlay of Nuit over the Milky Way, and it works perfectly. And I'm pretty certain that this is the case. And in places like Britain, if you go outside and try and look for the Milky Way, you will barely see it. But I mean, I've been in places like the Arizona desert at night where there is absolutely no light pollution, and the Milky Way stretches from horizon to horizon. It's an extraordinary sight, which, when you look at, can easily be construed as a person, a woman, stretching over the earth from horizon to horizon. So I understand how this whole concept kind of come about, particularly obviously as we're talking about the Northern Hemisphere, where Britain and obviously Egypt and obviously Göbekli Tepe were all situated. All of these ideas are born from our view of the night sky as viewed in the Northern Hemisphere, particularly to do with the North and the Pole Star and that area. So in other words, the ancient Egyptians saw the sun, which, remember, was incarnated as the pharaoh himself, as being born from the womb of this goddess called Nuit, the sky goddess.
Sure.
And the pyramid texts, which are the oldest accounts of the cosmological ideas and beliefs and spells of the ancient Egyptians, found in pyramids from just after the age of those at Giza, which date to around 2500, 2600 BC, actually talk about the pharaoh returning to the womb of Nuit, and that the womb of Nuit is represented by the sarcophagus, the coffin, by the tomb itself, which, of course, if you look at it from a pure Egyptological point of view, that's exactly what a pyramid is. It's a great tomb, ultimately. I mean, a lot of people, deny this or want to see it as something else, but it is ultimately a tomb. Yes, it's more than that. It's an ascension machine, basically. It's a way of projecting the soul back to its point of origin. And that's exactly what it was. So the fact that the stars of Cygnus reflect the geographical positions of the three pyramids at Giza makes absolute sense. In other words, what they're doing is they're resonating with the position in the sky of the womb of the sky goddess, which is where the pharaoh goes back to in death. So that's the reason why Cygnus could be so important in connection with the beliefs of the pyramid builders. So that's what I put in the Cygnus mystery, and it was repeated in subsequent books. And of course, when that book came out, all hell broke loose.
Bet it did, Andrew. I bet it did.
I mean, this was in 2006. And I mean, I had this diatribe online with Robert Bouval on forums and things that went to something like 60 pages.
Sure.
Of him trying to, destroy the connection between Cygnus and Giza and Egypt in general.
Yeah. And
me trying to counter that, but also showing that, that there were problems with the Orion correlation theory, and I think I held my ground pretty well, in all honesty. And if people want to read any of that, it's all linked up via andrewcollins.com.
Sure.
So it's all there. And I mean, you know, Robert Bovell remains a very good friend of mine, and, you know, the talk that we will actually even do a tour of Egypt together, possibly even as early as September, if I'm not arrested by that time, but we'll come on to that. But the relationship now between any of this and the discovery of the lost caves of Giza now comes into play, because if the three pyramids at Giza represented the three wing stars of Cygnus, of this bird flying down the Milky Way, then what about the bright star Deneb?
Sure.
Did that have a marker on the landscape of Giza? So if you look as to where that would be, it fell somewhere in the area of what's known as the Western Cemetery. Now, that's a couple of 100 meters to the due west of the Great Pyramid. So I started to focus my attentions on that area. And my colleague, Nigel Skinner-Simpson, one day turned up with a map of the plateau that had been done by an engineer. Oh God, his name's
Henry Salt, was it?
No.
The other guy.
It was the guy working with Howard Weiss.
Yes.
It'll come to me by the end of this conversation, I believe. And it was a map that showed just to the northwest of where I was looking for the Deneb spot, as we began to refer to it, which I'd actually even considered might even be a point of entrance into some kind of physical underworld that existed at Giza. There was somewhere marked as the pits, the tombs and pits of bird mummies, or birds. That's it. Tombs and pits and birds.
Wow.
And I looked at this and I thought, what the hell is that? I mean, I'd written books on Egypt, on the Giza. I thought I'd never noticed this before. And, I looked at the work of Howard Weiss, Colonel Howard Weiss,
sure,
dating from about 1840. And he had one reference, to the entry into this previously unrecorded tomb that talks about them going in and finding evidence of bird mummies, and it talks specifically about them removing this large mummy of a bird from it, and this seemed to tie up with this very vague reference on a map to the tombs and pits of bird mummies or birds, whatever it was. And I thought, I have to go here. I mean, I could find out absolutely nothing else about this place. So I thought, I'm going there. So I went there with my ex-wife, in 2007 for the first time, in January 2007. And we went into this tomb. It's at the northwest corner of the plateau. I mean, it's so far away from the pyramids that nobody ever goes there. Plus, there was a building there that until recently was the place where President Mubarak would actually spend, days, have a few days retreat. So
wow,
it was totally out of bounds. So nobody ever went over there. He would land with his helicopter, go into this place, spend a few days there, and then go back to his other residence in Cairo, presumably. So by this time, Mubarak wasn't there, and it was now being used to house engineers working somewhere, off the plateau or whatever. And so we went in there, and this place was unrecorded. I mean, there was nothing about this tomb anywhere, nothing published anywhere whatsoever in the modern day. And we went in there, and I was looking for some kind of entrance to a deeper level. Couldn't find one. Came away from there, and shortly after this time, Nigel came back to me, having discovered the diary notes of Henry Salt. Now, he was the British Consul General to Egypt around the year 1817, if I remember rightly. You'll probably be able to correct me on this one.
John Peering, was he the other engineer?
Perring, that's the guy.
John
Perring, of course. He was the guy that did the map.
That's right. Yeah,
but this was earlier. I mean, Perring and Weiss did their work around 1840. Henry Salt was working on the plateau, basically looking for antiquities and trying to record whatever he could around 1817, 1818, 1819, that sort of period. Mm-hmm. And he was working with an Italian by the name of
Cagfiari or Cagli.
Yeah, that's him, yeah. And I can't remember to pronounce his name now. But anyway, they were doing work on the plateau. And they discovered, according to these diary notes, which had only just been published that year, I mean, weren't even published when we'd gone into this, that they had uncovered this cave system and travelled a distance of several hundred yards within it. And that the Italian had continued on where salt had come out, and that they describe it. And Nigel knew that whatever this site was, it was absolutely unrecorded. There was nothing about this anywhere, and Salt actually says that this is in area GG on his map. Now, his map is covered with old style letters.
Oh God.
A to Z, and then A, B, 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 the rest of it. And the people that had actually done the commentary and had not translated, but just a commentary and republished this, which were members of the British Museum, it's Egyptologists working with the British Museum. They actually couldn't find this area GG. They believed it hadn't been marked. So they suggested it was somewhere to the north of the Great Pyramid. They were wrong. Nigel found it on the map, and it actually looked like 2-2, not GG. And he eventually, covered the whole map, every single point he accounted for. And that point GG corresponded directly to what we were now calling the Tomb of the Birds. The place that Weiss and Perring had explored about 18. And I just thought, oh my God. And I remember him telling me this.
You knew you had it.
We were sitting outside the British Museum in a cafe, and I just thought, this is it. This is the point of entry into Giza's underworld. And this was when was this? This was probably in towards the end of 2007. So we arranged to go back, and we went there finally in March 2008. And this time we went back to the Tomb of the Birds. Now, it's not easy to get there because wherever you go on the plateau, there are officials, there are tourist police inquiring what you're doing, where you're going, and generally turning you back. And so what we thought is the best way that you can go around the plateau and essentially not be ask too many questions is to go on camels.
Sure.
And you could, at that point, hire camels outside of the plateau. I mean, get official entry, visas. That's no problem. And then what you would do is you would actually enter the plateau via a entrance, which is now no longer there, to the south of the plateau. You'll be let in, and you could then essentially wander where you liked. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And so we carried all of our equipment that we felt we would need if indeed there were caves there. And we reached the Tomb of the Bird essentially unhindered. I mean, I think a couple of people asked us, what we were doing on, tourist police on camels or whatever. And we didn't have an official guide or anything. I mean, there was just a camel driver that was with us who happened to speak English. And we got to the Tomb of the Birds and we went inside and started looking around. And this time noticed in an area which we hadn't obviously looked properly enough before, a small crack in the rock wall that seemed to be a crack within a dry stone walling that had been covered in mortar, probably in classical times or something like that. And it had obviously been breached at some point in the past. And we looked into this and just were well, I mean, it was obviously a life-changing moment, because before us was the entrance into this massive natural cave system. I mean, it was it's something you would not imagine existed at Giza and had never been discovered before. And I mean, you can just imagine. I mean, I felt like Howard Carter or Lord Carnarvon discovering Tutankhamun's tomb at that moment. It was just extraordinary.
These moments don't come by too often, Andrew, do they?
No, and I think what's important here is to say that this was not some accidental discovery. This was the end product of 4 to 5 years' work on the behalf of myself and Nigel Skinner Simpson. We didn't discover this by accident. Yeah. And in other words, this was a precision research project that gradually pinned down the exact location of this. And we'd even prepared a report up to this point of every discovery, complete with references and everything to how we got to this point, which we said we would hand over to any authorities if we got into any problems.
Just to pay homage to Nigel, because I think if I was then doing any type of research, Andrew, this is the guy I want on the team, because he's so prolific and dogmatic and academic and, tenacious. He's got all the qualities you need.
He absolutely. I mean, the thing is that Nigel is the academic that isn't the academic. Yeah. In other words, because he isn't constrained by the scholarly community that would sort of hold you back from looking in certain areas, whatever. He's able to use a scholarly mind to make links and to go into absolute depths of reading the most boring material, which you and I would probably not bother to do.
Sure.
But he does that. He's extremely meticulous in what he does, and will only come back to you and give you the summary of his work if he is absolutely dead certain that what he's saying is right. In other words, like an academic would. Yeah. And so, as I said, without him, I would not have been able to achieve it. It's as simple as that. So we went in there twice in March. We went back there the following month in April 2008. So we went in there 4 times in all, each time pushing further and further and further until we got to what we called the tube, which was a distance of approximately about 110 meters from the entrance. I know it doesn't sound like a lot, but it took a lot to get there.
Yeah.
And what happened is that the room, which, is like the final place you can go, then shrinks down and you have to go through this tube. And for safety reasons and other reasons at the time, we felt it was best to leave this and come back and do this when we had better equipment. Plus, we'd already found that there were spiders in there, which were almost certainly white widow spiders, which are deadly poisonous.
Wow.
Plus, the place was full of bats, of course. I mean, which were just flying about all over the place.
Andrew, I was in the Red Pyramid, and just the smell of the ammonia cuts you in the nose. And I mean, and it's just a couple of bats in there. I wouldn't have been in the cave. You're a brave man for even going in, Andrew. The bats would have been enough for me, never mind the white widows. But, the ambience in there must have been horrible, but kind of shocking and awe, and at the same time. I mean, this is quite, tell us about the height of it as well, Andrew, because this is quite a big cavern, really.
Some of it's very high. I mean, the profile of it is very obviously that of karst cave. In other words, it's been cut into limestone by the actions of water and any acidity that's been within that water. Now, it's a natural cave system. It's relatively unmarked inside. I mean, there are a few linear scrapes that have been put in various places, which you could say are chamfering the walls, to maybe, allow people an easier passage. But some of them are in areas where you wouldn't need to do it. And that does suggest that these like parallel lines that have been carved into it may have some kind of symbolic function. And so there's clearly been human activity in here, but it's not covered in hieroglyphs. It is clearly been used for some kind of ritual or ceremonial purpose. Plus, oozing from the walls is this red ochre powder.
Oh, wow.
And this red ochre, obviously red ochre is something which has been sought since Paleolithic times as a symbol of blood and of life, and was often used and sprinkled over human burials in many parts of the world. Even the Neanderthals may well have used ochre in this way. And so, you know, in other words, we're here in the womb of some kind of earth mother, if you like, with the ochre almost representing, you know, the blood of that, you know, birth canal or whatever. And it's quite obvious that the ancient Egyptians, who would unquestionably have been aware of this cave system, I mean, all right, you could argue as to exactly how old, whether or not it was accessible during the Pyramid Age or earlier or whatever. I think it probably was. Almost certainly it would have had some kind of access to the outside, because obviously you got the tomb there, and the skeptic would argue that the tomb was cut and that broke through into some natural fissure, which then exposed the proximity of the caves. I don't think so. What I think is that the fissure was there and was expanded to incorporate the tomb entrance.
That's how they... Sorry, isn't that how they did the Valley of the Kings? That same method. They to cut a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, they used the natural cracks and the fissures to get in down a tunnel.
Well, I'm not aware of that, but if that's true, then that makes sense of my surmise relating
definitely, Andrew.
I mean, well, it makes absolute sense, doesn't it? I mean, it means you don't have to, you know, cut your way through so much rock. It's common sense.
Yeah.
So, but it was not full of hieroglyphs. There were no artifacts there. I mean, the only thing, it was full of bones, by the way, full of animal bones, you know, long bones, skulls, the rest of it, which presumably, for the most part, had been brought in by hyenas and things like that, you know, dragging in some carcass at some point. But it was full of bones everywhere. Going back, you know, sort of tens of meters beyond and whatever. So, I mean, it was a really spooky, eerie place. Plus, it was so hot in there. I mean, it was stifling. And I mean, and the other problem is that because of the background, because of the accessible of the place, almost certainly the levels of CO2 and whatever were very high in there. And I remember when myself and my ex-wife got to the furthest point within the caves, and we just wanted to sit down and just rest and stay there. And eventually we did get up and go, and it was only afterwards that I read about the effects of carbon dioxide, and that actually makes you just want to sit down and rest and do nothing. Because it's beginning to affect the brain, and you just have this thing where you just want to fall asleep.
Lethargic.
And in a way, I'm pretty certain that is what was beginning to affect us down there.
I think you guys did well to get to the back chamber and to find that tunnel. Perhaps, Andrew, do you think that tunnel would lead on a bit to another cavern?
It does. I mean, you know, I've been told I can't reveal where I know this information, but I have an extremely reliable academic source that tells me that the tube does continue.
Oh, wow.
And not only that, but we believe that we probably identified at least one more fissure that from the lower part of the tomb, which was only exposed after our presence in there, that also leads into the cave system as well. So, you know, this is just the start of it. It obviously heads off in the direction of the second pyramid, and I find that very important because this is where the tomb of Hermes Trismegistus was said to be located, and he is said to lie with in his hands the original so-called emerald tablets on which are written the secrets of creation. And I sense that this is what people believed was at the end of those caves. And I sense also that they were open in classical times, so people were able to get into them then, because the entrance to them was clearly used as some kind of shrine to bird cults. You know, they were putting bird mummies and things like that in there, just like they were at Saqqara, a few miles to the south of Giza. So this was being used in association with a cult to do with the bird. Remember, the bird is the main symbol of Cygnus. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I was here is because I was looking for the Deneb spot of the correlation of Cygnus with the stars at Giza.
What an incredible journey that led you to that point.
Well, if people are interested, I wrote a whole book about it called Beneath the Pyramids, which came out in 2009. However, perhaps we should talk about what's happening today, 2014, 2015.
Well, the fact that Zahi Hawass is not in control anymore, because I know Zahi stepped in and manipulated events, and, he put an iron grill on the gate of the caves.
Well, yeah, but I asked him to do that personally.
Oh, okay.
And I asked him to do that because eventually what happened was that we realised that the only way forward now was to make known our discoveries to the authorities. Mm-hmm. We could not continue to do this in a surreptitious way. I mean, this wasn't illegal, but it was in a manner which was outside the obvious jurisdiction of the authorities.
Sure.
So myself and my ex-wife went to see Zahi Hawass in April 2009.
Okay.
That was our first opportunity to get back there, and obviously we needed to talk to him face to face.
Sure.
And by this time he already knew about it because the subject matter had been presented to him by a mutual friend of ours by the name of John Van Alken, the previous October 2008, and he'd been shown pictures then and thanked John for bringing the matter to his attention. However, now I'm presenting Zahi Hawass with pictures of the interior of the caves and also the report that myself and Nigel did on how we actually, reached this position and found the caves themselves. And so we're giving him this, and now he's gone into denial. Now he's saying there are no caves there. We know everything about the plateau. Amateurs cannot come in and find things like this. We know everything about everything, and the funny thing is that he was saying this and he was like gesticulating with his hands, throwing them up in the air. And then there was just a moment of silence after he said this. And my ex-wife, Sue, she just burst into laughter because it came across as a joke. It was almost like we suddenly get the joke that you have to say this, don't you? That you have to say this because amateurs like us cannot find things like this, so that you have to deny it.
Yeah.
It was almost like there was a little bit of a wry smile on his face, or there could have been, because this is all a joke, isn't it? Yeah. And indeed it was, because obviously as soon as we went out of his office, he ordered excavations of the Tomb of the Birds, which took place later that year. They uncovered a whole lower area, an incredible lower area of about, 10 to 20 rooms underneath it, which we think Weiss and Perrin had already discovered in 1840 and were somehow covered up afterwards.
Oh, wow.
And then in 2010, we get to see on television in the TV reality show Chasing Mummies featuring Zahi Hawass going into the caves for the first time, and this being recorded on camera, which is so important, and him going inside being frightened of bats, which was the name of the actual episode, which was called Bats. And he gets to the end of it, gets to the tube, and he turns to the camera and says, "This is the most incredible experience that I've had at Giza." Now that says a lot.
Wow.
And I'm so glad that this was recorded in this way, because this was his genuine reaction to entering these caves, which he'd been obviously very skeptical about, and was even skeptical about to some degree when he went into the case, because they recorded his words. So that's important. But the problem is that there the matter might have rested. And I mean, yes, I did ask Zahi Hawass to put a gate over it, and the reason I asked him to do this is because I knew that as soon as knowledge of these discoveries hit the internet, there would be idiots going in those caves and doing very stupid things and compromising the untouched archaeology inside there.
For sure.
And in all honesty, before the gates went on there, and I'm afraid even afterwards, that's exactly what's happened. If we go in there now and find an Atlantean crystal, there is,
there's no question.
There's no way of knowing whether it was there, 10,000 years ago or 10 months ago. Do you know what I mean?
Sure. What's good, Andrew, is you're not bitter about the whole saga, because some people you're still enthusiastic about it, and you're enthusiastic that at least Zahi documented it on camera, because it's all for the greater good, Andrew. There's some other people in your position, Andrew, may have been a lot bitter about that and angry. Look, it was the only way that it could go. We could not continue to go there and explore in a surreptitious way. We could not do that. We had to bring it to the attention of the authorities, because it was such a major discovery. Yeah.
And I just hope that one day we are allowed to go back there. But I'm afraid to say at the moment that's looking more and more unlikely, because obviously in 2010 we have the whole start of the so-called Arab Spring.
Mm-hmm.
You have the overthrow of Mubarak. You have the complete change, not only of the government of Egypt into a much more Muslim-based regime,
sure,
but also the Antiquities Commission changes as well. The Supreme Council of Antiquities are in the hands of other people. There's some old guard, some new guard. There's a lot of infighting. Zahi Hawass is thrown out, then he's brought back, then he's thrown out, then he's brought back. And some points he's going to be put in prison. Some points he's been, exonerated, etc., etc. And this is all going on now. And unfortunately, the discovery of those caves in 2008 has now become a central feature of all of this backbiting and in politics within the Antiquities Commission. And the reason why this has come up is that just a year or so ago, 3 German researchers went inside the Great Pyramid with official permission. They had, the correct, documents to allow them to go in there, which they got via a tourist company in Egypt. They went in there with officials, and they went in there with their tourist guides.
Mm-hmm.
They were allowed to go up into the relieving chambers above the king's chamber. And here, in the darkness, they took some fine, scrapings of a hieroglyph. Now, they thought they were getting the hieroglyph that said the name Khufu, which is the only thing tying the Great Pyramid directly with this particular, pharaoh, other than the accounts of Herodotus, for instance, from the 5th century BC.
Mm-hmm.
So they came away from there. They went back to Germany,
mm-hmm.
and they stupidly put a film of themselves doing this on YouTube. The Egyptian authorities saw this, were up in arms, turned around to the Antiquities people and said, "What the hell are you doing here?"
Yeah. And
the whole thing became this huge fraud and a court case where these guys have only just been convicted of the way they couldn't, because they had official permission, they couldn't get him on that way. They put in prison the guides. They put in prison the officials that went with them. 6 people have been put away and are currently languishing in an Egyptian jail over this business.
For 5 years. For 5 years, Andrew, they got that.
Plus, as you just said, the Germans, in their absence, in absentia, have been given 5-year prison sentence for illegally removing, taking out, exporting, Egyptian antiquities, i.e. this fine powder, which, by the way, they've since returned back, or allegedly all of it, to Egypt. So, if they ever step back in Egypt, they're going to be arrested and put in jail. But what happened is that earlier the same day that they went into the Great Pyramid and got these scrapings, they also went in the Tomb of the Birds and apparently explored the caves.
Really?
Yeah. They had official permission to be in there again. So in other words, the gate must have been officially opened.
Wow.
They were officially allowed in there. So of course, suddenly into this court case, the Tomb of the Birds is being mentioned. In fact, the Tomb of the Birds is even mentioned in their conviction. It's actually mentioned by name that, that as a part of the conviction of these guys that have taken them in there. So then people start saying, well, what is this Tomb of the Birds? And suddenly they find a copy of my book, Beneath the Pyramids, and the whole story of how we discovered it in 2008 has now become a massive debate amongst the old guard and the new guard, and it's been featured in the Egyptian press. I didn't realise this since 2013, and in there, myself and obviously my cohorts who went out there, which is essentially myself, Nigel Skinner-Simpson, and my ex-wife, are being accused of illegally surveying and excavating the Tomb of the Birds, which means that if the matter is taken to higher authorities, we could be put on trial.
I had covered the German story a couple of times, and Robert has been on talking about it before, but I actually hadn't been aware of that angle with you, Andrew. It's totally new to me. It's amazing what happens, and wow, I actually wasn't aware the Germans even were in the Tomb of the Birds.
The same day.
I can see the predicament.
Before they'd gone into the Great Pyramid, that's where they were.
Wow, I can see the predicament now, Andrew.
And the thing is that what they'd said is the reason why they were there is to check the theories of Andrew Collins.
Oh, God.
And therefore, that directly linked my name to it.
Yeah.
And, wow, if you look in the Egyptian press, there's pictures that, the stories which are generally in Arabic, from the main papers and the main, press associations there. And there's pictures of myself, like my ex-wife, inside the caves, all the rest of it, splattered across the Egyptian press at the moment.
Oh God. The Egyptians have a funny way of doing business. It's in the Western world, we got our laws and our courts. See Britain and Ireland and Europe, it's a very regulated law system and courts, but in Egypt, it's a bit kind of Western, Wild West, people taking pot shots at people and seeming to get away with it. And it's just, the law system is just chaotic and erratic and.
Yeah. But anyway, just to, alleviate any people that might be worried over the situation here, I don't think it's likely that, we will be put on trial, because they're mainly aiming at the people who are behind it. In other words, any, officials that may have allowed us in, and, they're aiming at them because they are part of the old guard and the new guard want them out. So, in other words, if we comply with the new guard and, help them with their inquiries, so to speak, then that will help them in their, political gains, as it were. But it's something where if the winds change, we could be in trouble. And obviously I'm hoping that won't be the case, particularly as I would like to go back to Egypt again. And although there's no official extraditing procedure between Egypt and Britain, just as presumably there isn't between Germany and Egypt, it would still mess your life up a lot, because obviously the Egyptian government can apply for an individual on an individual basis for extradition. And that can mess up your life a lot. In that respect, looking at the whole political saga, do you have any regrets with Beneath the Pyramids book or the discovery of the cave, Andrew? It's an honest account of what happened. So, it is what it is. Clearly I don't want to spend my time languishing in an Egyptian jail, because I think it would probably kill other than the most hardy of people. But, there's nothing I can do about it. It's history. It's what happened, and I would not change it for the world. So it is what it is. Clearly I will, and I am helping these people to give them a full account of what happened and who we spoke to and how we were able to get into these previously unrecorded caves and previously unrecorded, tomb. And just hope for the best. Yeah. I bet you're glad you documented it as you went now, Andrew, in the way you did in the academic. This is what we come back to, the way that I work. this is how this is how I work. I mean, you know, I do it almost like a diary.
Yeah.
It's a diary which becomes books. And so my life is as a diary, really, in all the different books going all the way back to the 1980s. Mm-hmm. If people read my books, from then to now, it's a catalogue of everything that's happened. It's a, you know, everything. I mean, whether it's in Cuba, whether it's in Egypt, Turkey, mm-hmm. Jordan, looking for the mountain of God, you know, in West Virginia, etc., you know, this is my life. This is what I did. This is what I found, and it's in those books. So
sure.
I can't hide from it. It's a public thing.
Sure. Andrew, we're at the top of the show for the second hour. I never even got a chance to get onto LightQuest. We're out of time. I really the funny thing is I've never got a chance to talk to you about any of the UFO investigations or research. We'll have to have you on again in the near future, Andrew.
Certainly.
Andrew, again, give us out your website one more time. And
okay, it's www.andrewcollins.com. Obviously, if you're interested in those tours, particularly those to Göbekli Tepe, I think, and obviously Peru and Bolivia, which are going to be great this year. And the books, Göbekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, Beneath the Pyramids we talked about, and of course the Cygnus mystery. They're all available still. Sure.
I'm going to link up the books as well and the tours, Andrew, on your website on the Capricorn Radio events page as well. I wish you every success in the tour. And like you say, it's time to get to Göbekli Tepe before they shut it down for a little while. But, you know, it may be better in the long run. But
it probably will, yeah.
Yeah. We may see you for a TV interview sometime in the near future, Andrew. But in the meantime, I wish you every success this year.
Thank you very much. All the best.